Dad was in an ICU suffering from pneumonia and sepsis after dealing with a host of neurological issues this summer.
Life is so difficult and challenging that unless you give it everything you have, and then you'll be a force for darkness and not good.
For 3 decades, Jordan Peterson stood before packed lecture halls, rolling cameras, and tens of millions of restless minds. And he gave them something rare. A message that cut clean through the noise of a distracted, confused generation. He told the world that life is suffering, and that the only response worthy of a human being is to carry that suffering with purpose, with meaning, with your spine straight and your eyes open. He built an intellectual empire on that single, unflinching premise. He wrote books that sold over 10 million copies. He amassed a following that stretched across every digital platform on Earth. And when he looked at the lost young men of the Western world, the ones drifting without direction, without purpose, without anyone willing to speak honestly to them, he did not flinch. With the clinical precision of a psychologist and the urgent conviction of a prophet, he said, "Clean your room. Tell the truth, stand up straight, carry your cross." And they listened, because he meant every word. But here is something that most people don't know yet, and we'll get to it. There came a moment when the very philosophy Jordan Peterson had spent his life teaching the world became the thing the world would silently expect him to prove with his own suffering body. Now, in the spring of 2026, Jordan Peterson is at home. He is not delivering lectures. He is not sitting across from interviewers. He is not weighing in on the political conversations that his absence leaves strangely, noticeably quieter. He is at home with his wife of 37 years, surrounded by companions who help him move through the hours of each day. According to the woman who has spent her entire life beside him, his mornings are brutally painful, discouraging in ways that are difficult to put into words. Later in the day, much later, she was careful to say, there is sometimes relief. Sometimes. The man who taught the world to bear suffering is now learning something he could never have scripted. What it feels like when the suffering has no clear meaning yet. And that brings us to the question worth sitting with before we go any further. What do you do when the philosophy you have given your entire life to defending is the very thing the world now expects you to prove with your own body? This is not a story about a public figure's decline. It is not a story about controversy, ideology, or the culture wars that made Jordan Peterson one of the most polarizing and celebrated intellectuals of his generation. This is a story about one man, one woman, one marriage, one diagnosis, and what happens when a life built on confronting hard truths finally arrives at the hardest truth of all. His wife said it plainly, 4 words that landed like a quiet verdict. He is not talking about going back to work yet. 4 words, 37 years of marriage, 30 years of public life, and now silence. That silence and everything living inside it is what this story is about. Fairview, Alberta, is not the kind of place that produces global icons. It sits in the northwestern corner of Canada's prairie provinces.
And if you're in dire straits and dire circumstances, just look at how much opportunity you have to make things better.
Flat, cold, and far from everything that the world tends to call important. A small town of a few thousand souls, where winters arrive early and stay long, where the horizon stretches in every direction as an unbroken line of frozen earth and open sky, where the distance between who you are and who you might become feels, at times, immeasurable. Jordan Burnt Peterson was born there on the 12th of June, 1962. He grew up inside that cold, that flatness, and that silence, and he read, obsessively, relentlessly, the kind of reading that is not a hobby but a survival strategy, a young mind clawing its way toward meaning in a landscape that offered very few obvious answers. What compels a boy from the Canadian prairies to spend his adolescence wrestling with the darkest corners of Western philosophy? What draws someone that young toward Carl Jung, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Friedrich Nietzsche, toward thinkers who stared directly into the abyss and came back with maps? There are no simple answers, but this much is clear. Jordan Peterson did not stumble into the study of suffering. He went looking for it deliberately, because something in him understood very early on that the questions no one wanted to ask were the only questions that truly mattered. He studied political science at the University of Alberta before pivoting to psychology, a pivot that would define everything that followed. He completed his doctorate at McGill University. He taught at Harvard. And then, in 1998, he returned to Canada and accepted a position at the University of Toronto, where he would spend the better part of 2 decades turning ordinary lecture halls into something closer to confessionals. Rooms where young people, mostly young men, came to hear someone finally say the things they had felt but could never quite put into words. His first book, Maps of Meaning, appeared in 1999, dense, demanding, and deeply original, an attempt to weave together mythology, neuroscience, and Jungian psychology into a unified theory of how human beings construct meaning. It was not a bestseller. It was something more durable than that, a foundation, a quiet signal sent into the intellectual atmosphere that a different kind of thinker had arrived. For the next 17 years, Peterson built his reputation the slow way, lecture by lecture, student by student. Those lectures, eventually uploaded to YouTube, found audiences that no university classroom could ever have contained. Millions of views, then tens of millions. An entire generation of young people drifting in a culture that had stopped offering them coherent frameworks for living discovered a professor in Toronto who was willing to say plainly, life is hard, meaning is real, and you are capable of far more than you think. Then came 2016, and everything changed overnight. The Canadian government introduced legislation that, in Peterson's interpretation, would compel the use of specific gender pronouns under threat of legal sanction. Peterson refused. He made videos explaining why. He went on television. He debated. He stood in the full force of institutional pressure, and he did not move. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. The support was equally immediate and equally ferocious. Within weeks, Jordan Peterson had become the most talked about academic on earth, celebrated by millions as a voice of reason, condemned by others as a reactionary. Either way, heard. 12 Rules for Life, published in January 2018, detonated. 10 million copies, translated into 50 languages. A nonfiction book about personal responsibility, Jungian archetypes, and biblical narrative that outsold memoirs, thrillers, and celebrity cookbooks. He toured every major city in the Western world. He sold out theaters. He stood before thousands of people who had come not just to listen, but to tell him, through their applause and through their tears, that what he was saying had changed something fundamental in how they understood their own lives. And then, at the very height of all of it, the tour, the interviews, the debates, the global platform, Tammy got sick. That was the year Jordan Peterson married Tammy Roberts. They had been together since childhood. Quite literally, they had known each other since the age of 8. By the time they married, she was not simply his wife. She was the architecture of his entire life. The person who existed before the fame, before the books, before the millions of followers who had discovered him on a screen. In 2019, she was diagnosed with kidney cancer. What do you do when the person who is the foundation of everything you have built is suddenly under threat? when the one relationship that preceded all of it, the lectures, the books, the global platform, is suddenly fighting for its life. You do what you can. You try to hold everything together. Peterson began taking medication to manage the anxiety and the sleeplessness. A benzodiazepine called clonazepam, prescribed to help him cope with the impossible weight of watching his wife face a diagnosis that carried no guarantees. At first, it was simply that, a tool, a medical intervention in a moment of acute crisis. What he could not know, what no one warned him about clearly enough, was that benzodiazepines carry a cost that arrives quietly on the back end. Dependency forms without announcement, and withdrawal, when it finally comes, does not arrive gently. By the time Peterson understood the depth of the situation he was in, he was already inside it. He tried to stop. The withdrawal was catastrophic. In 2020, in an act of desperate medical urgency, he traveled to Russia for a procedure involving medically induced sedation, an attempt to sleep through the most severe phase of withdrawal in a controlled clinical environment. He spent a month in a Russian intensive care unit. He came back diminished, not defeated, never that, but diminished, still not well. In 2022, he sat across from Joe Rogan and said something that landed with the quiet force of a confession from a man who had spent his entire career teaching others how to endure. I was in excruciating pain for 2 years, pain at levels that I didn't know was possible. Sit with that sentence for a moment. The man who wrote the book on suffering, literally, sitting in a podcast studio and admitting that pain had found registers in him he had not known existed. Tammy survived. The cancer did not win. And Peterson, slowly and painfully, began to rebuild. He released Beyond Order in 2021, written during the worst of it while still recovering. A book about the necessity of order and meaning in the face of chaos, written by a man living inside the very chaos he was describing. He returned to public life. He launched the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. He kept going. He always kept going. But the body was quietly keeping its own account. Stay with us, because what happens next, inside a hospital room in Zurich, Switzerland, is the moment this story takes a turn that no one saw coming. And it will change the way you understand everything that has come before it. There is a hospital room in Zurich that Jordan Peterson will never fully leave. He checked in for pneumonia, a serious hospitalization, yes, but manageable. The kind of medical episode that a man of 63, already battle-scarred from years of withdrawal and slow recovery, might reasonably expect to survive and move past. He had survived worse. He had survived a Russian intensive care unit. He had survived 2 years of pain at levels, in his own words, that he didn't know were possible. He had survived the withdrawal, the disorientation, the long and grinding crawl back toward function. He survived the pneumonia too. But inside that Swiss intensive care unit, something else entered his system. Sepsis. A systemic infection, the body's immune response spiraling beyond its own control, and sepsis in a nervous system already carrying the accumulated damage of years of benzodiazepine withdrawal did not simply pass through. It landed. It took hold. It accelerated a process that was already quietly underway in ways that medicine had not yet fully mapped. What emerged from that hospitalization was not the Jordan Peterson who had walked in. What emerged was a man living with tardive akathisia. Say those words slowly, because they deserve precision. Tardive akathisia. Tardive meaning delayed, meaning the damage does not arrive in the moment of exposure but later, sometimes much later, long after the medication has been discontinued. Akathisia from the Greek, meaning the inability to remain still, a neurological condition characterized by an internal restlessness so severe, so unrelenting, so physically overwhelming, that patients do not describe it as discomfort. They describe it as torment, not an inconvenience, an invasion. The body generating distress signals from the inside with no off switch and no clear exit. It is a condition known to occur as a consequence of discontinuing certain psychiatric medications, drugs that block dopamine receptors, that alter the brain's fundamental signaling architecture, that the central nervous system builds its entire functional equilibrium around. When those medications are removed, the system that adapted to them is suddenly without its anchor. And in some patients, not all, but some, the result is a neurological injury that does not simply resolve. That condition persists. In some cases, it is permanent. Jordan Peterson spent 6 years trying to free himself from one medication, and the process of getting free left him with a neurological injury that may stay with him for the rest of his life. Think about the architecture of that tragedy. Not a sudden accident, not a diagnosis that arrived from nowhere, a slow-motion cascade, every decision made in good faith, every medical intervention pursued in crisis, every step of the withdrawal undertaken in the sincere belief that the other side would eventually come. For Jordan Peterson, the other side has not yet fully arrived. He is 63 years old, and he is in pain. By early 2026, something had shifted visibly in Peterson's public presence. Events disappeared from his website quietly without announcement. The calendar that had once been packed with speaking engagements, conferences, and international appearances went blank. No statement, no explanation, just absence. The kind of absence that speaks louder than any press release. Then in April of 2026, his daughter Michaela broke the silence. Michaela Peterson, herself a public figure in health and wellness, herself a survivor of a devastating autoimmune condition that had nearly robbed her of her mobility as a teenager, told the world what the empty calendar had already suggested. Her father was stepping away from everything. The cause was a neurological injury induced by psychiatric medication. The symptom was akathisia. The world heard it and held its breath. Because Jordan Peterson is not simply a famous person who is ill. He is the person who built an entire intellectual architecture around the idea that suffering can be made meaningful. That when a human being faces the very worst the world can offer, they have both the capacity and the obligation to find within that worst something worth carrying forward. He is the man who told millions of people in the middle of their own private collapses that the antidote to chaos is to accept the weight and walk forward anyway. Now the walk itself is the hard part. On the 4th of May, 2026, Tammy Peterson gave an interview to the New York Post. It was not long. It was not dramatic. It was something rarer and in its restraint more devastating. A wife telling the truth about her husband without catastrophizing, without minimizing, and without pretending the situation is anything other than what it is. She said Dr. Peterson is at home with family and helpful companions. She said he is not talking about going back to work yet. She said his mornings are brutally painful and discouraging. Later, much later in the day, he sometimes feels some relief. And then she said the sentence that stopped everything. He feels as if he is in another realm of pain. Not a different degree of the same pain, another realm entirely, a place the map does not cover, a territory without landmarks. Tammy did not stop there. She addressed the medications. She addressed the medical system. She said what her husband in his silence could not. The damage done from psychiatric medications from over 6 years ago takes patience, time, and loving attention. And then, with a precision that carried more weight than any lecture, she said, "The medical industry will have to face this evidence and take steps to protect the public from harm. Benzodiazepines should only be used in life-saving cases." That is not anger. That is testimony. The testimony of a woman who watched from the closest possible distance what happens when a dependency-forming drug is prescribed in a moment of crisis, without anyone clearly communicating what the exit would cost. Jonathan Page, theologian, artist, and one of Peterson's closest friends, described what the days actually look like from the outside. Good days, he said, look like struggle and pain, but Peterson is still capable of taking walks, working on projects, having conversations just with difficulty, and never for long. Bad days are constant pain and akathisia. He struggles to focus. He lapses into discouragement and despair. Never for long. Even the good days never for long. The Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, the organization Peterson co-founded, held its third annual conference in London in June of 2026. The work continued. The institution he built continued to function in the world. He was not there. And that absence, more than any diagnosis, more than any interview, is the clearest measure of how serious this is. Jordan Peterson does not miss things because he is tired. He misses things because his body will not cooperate with the simplest requirements of showing up. Tammy said it plainly. He misses the opportunity to weigh in on what is happening in the world. The same mind that produced 10 million copies of a book about how to live, still running, still reaching. But the body, the mornings, another realm of pain. Now here is the uncomfortable question that hangs over all of this. Jordan Peterson built a philosophy that insists on the meaningfulness of suffering, that the person who carries their pain honestly, who tells the truth even when the truth is costly, is living rightly regardless of outcomes. But what happens when the suffering resists meaning? When the body's distress signals are so relentless that the very cognitive architecture required to find meaning is itself compromised? What happens when the man who told the world to stand up straight is fighting a condition whose primary symptom is the inability to be still? Is the philosophy failing him? Or is it, in its most extreme test, being proven in ways no lecture hall could ever demonstrate? We don't know the answer yet. And that not knowing is itself part of the story. What we do know is this: akathisia can be permanent. The damage from prolonged benzodiazepine use and withdrawal does not resolve on a predictable timeline, if it resolves at all. The medical literature is honest about its own limitations here, and those limitations are precisely what Tammy was pointing at. Jordan Peterson is not a cautionary tale. He is a human being inside a medical reality that millions of people share, but that few public figures ever describe from the inside. In his silence, he may be doing something that matters as much as any lecture he ever gave, demonstrating that the damage is real, that the suffering is real, and that the system that created this outcome needs to be held accountable. He is 63 years old, and somewhere in a house in Canada, on a morning his wife describes as brutal, the man who spent 30 years teaching the world about suffering is living inside a chapter he did not write and cannot yet end. There is a kind of courage that has no audience. Not the courage of the lecture hall, where thousands rise to their feet and the applause fills the room like a physical force. Not the courage of the debate stage, where the cameras are rolling and the mind sharpens under pressure. Not even the courage of the book, the solitary, disciplined courage of committing your deepest convictions to the page and sending them into the world to be judged. There is another kind entirely, the kind that happens in the morning, in the hours before the day has gathered enough momentum to offer any relief, in the rooms cameras never enter, where the only witnesses are the people who chose to stay. That is the courage Jordan Peterson is living now. Tammy chose her words with the weight of someone who has measured every syllable. Brutally painful, discouraging, another realm of pain. These are not the words of a woman softening a difficult truth for public consumption. These are the words of a woman who has sat beside the same person since they were 8 years old, who has watched him build and break and rebuild, and who is now telling the world exactly what she sees. Not because it is comfortable, because the truth in their household has always been the only currency worth spending. He taught that, she learned it beside him, and now she is using it on his behalf. She did not say he was fine. She did not offer the carefully managed statement that public relations logic would have demanded. She said he is not talking about going back to work yet, that small word doing enormous work, carrying honesty about the present and a refusal to surrender the future all at once. And then she turned toward the system. Benzodiazepines should only be used in life-saving cases, words that name what happened without flinching from the naming. Tammy Peterson, the woman who faced kidney cancer, who rebuilt her own health through approaches the mainstream initially dismissed, who has watched her husband navigate a medical labyrinth that should never have existed, is now speaking publicly about what that labyrinth cost, not in bitterness, in testimony. And this matters beyond Jordan Peterson, because he is not the only person to whom this has happened. Tammy said so herself. He is the most visible, but he is not the only one. There are countless testimonials from people who have suffered damage from psychiatric medications. Jordan Peterson simply has the loudest silence, precisely because his voice was once so omnipresent. The injury is not unique to him, and the testimony his wife has delivered is not only about him. The man who built an entire platform on telling uncomfortable truths has, through Tammy's words, through the simple fact of what is happening to his body, delivered one of the most uncomfortable truths of his career. Not from a stage, not through a microphone, but through the honest description of a woman brave enough to say exactly what she sees. Jonathan Pageau said something worth sitting with. Good days look like struggle and pain. That is the floor, the best version of the present moment. And yet, on those days, Peterson is still capable of taking walks, working on projects, having meaningful conversations, just with difficulty, and never for long. Never for long. But still, there is an entire philosophy contained in those two words. Jordan Peterson spent 30 years arguing that meaning is not found in the absence of suffering, but in what a person does with it, in the direction they choose to move, however slowly, however painfully. That the hero is not the person who escapes the darkness, but the person who carries a light into it and keeps walking. He is still walking. It costs him enormously, in ways most people watching from the outside will never fully comprehend. But the walks happen, the conversations happen, with difficulty and never for long, but they happen. This is not a triumphant narrative. It would be dishonest to frame it as one, but it is not a story of defeat either. It is something harder to categorize, and perhaps for that reason more worth paying attention to. A story still in progress. A chapter without resolution, being lived by a man who spent his entire career insisting that the unresolved chapters are the ones that matter most. Does Jordan Peterson, in those brutal mornings, still believe in his own philosophy? We cannot know. We are not in that room. We don't have access to whatever moves through the mind of a 63-year-old man who gave 30 years of his life building frameworks for endurance. Frameworks he now needs more personally than he ever anticipated. But what is visible from the outside is this. He has not retracted anything. He has not issued a statement saying the philosophy was wrong, that the suffering broke the argument, that the lectures were false comfort. The silence is not repudiation. The absence is not abandonment. He is, in Tammy's words, at home, with family, with companions, with the person who has been beside him since they were children, waiting with patience, time, and loving attention. The exact prescription Tammy named publicly, without apology, as the only treatment that makes any sense right now. If you have ever carried something truly heavy, not the manageable weight of ordinary difficulty, but the crushing, specific weight of something that will not lift no matter how correctly you try to respond to it, then something in this story will have reached you in a place that analysis cannot fully access. And if Jordan Peterson has ever said something that landed in you and rearranged something important, if one lecture, one page, one argument ever found the exact nerve that needed to be found at the exact moment you needed it found, then you already know what his absence from the public conversation feels like. It feels like a frequency going quiet, a voice that knew how to speak directly into the part of you that most needed to be spoken to, temporarily gone off the air. The Send. Ori is not over. The man who taught millions to bear suffering with meaning is still here, still in the mornings, still in the walks, still with difficulty and never for long, but still present. And if there is one thing 30 years of his work would predict about what comes next, it is this. The people who expect Jordan Peterson to stay silent forever do not yet understand who Jordan Peterson is. If you want to be watching when that next chapter begins, subscribe to the Celebrity Insider, because when he finds his way back, you will want to have been here from the beginning.